Hi, I'm Lily. And last Thanksgiving, my husband's family served me cold turkey scraps on a paper plate while everyone else feasted on fine china. They thought I was just some small-town nobody who married above her station. What they didn't know was that I had just purchased the 500-acre farm that's been their family's pride and joy for 3 generations. The same farm they were about to lose to foreclosure. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The same farm where we were sitting for that humiliating dinner. But here's the twist that nobody saw coming, not even my husband. The woman they treated like hired help had been quietly planning their downfall for months, and the moment I chose to reveal the truth would shatter their perfect family image forever. The November air in Millbrook Valley carried the scent of wood smoke and dying leaves as I pulled into the circular driveway of Whitfield Acres. The sprawling farmhouse stood like a monument to New England tradition, its white clapboard siding and hunter green shutters picture perfect against the backdrop of rolling hills dotted with maple trees. This would be my 3rd Thanksgiving with the Brennan family, and my stomach already twisted with familiar dread. Marcus squeezed my hand as we sat in our Honda Civic, watching his relatives emerge from luxury SUVs and imported sedans. His BMW was in the shop, which meant we'd arrived in what his mother Victoria always referred to as that little economy car, with barely concealed disgust. The contrast wasn't lost on me. While Marcus's cousins stepped out wearing designer boots and cashmere coats, I smoothed down my Target sweater and checked my reflection in the visor mirror one last time. "Remember what we talked about," Marcus said softly, his brown eyes apologetic. "Just try to keep the peace. Mom's been stressed about the farm situation." The farm situation. That's what the Brennan family called their mounting debt and the foreclosure notice that had arrived 6 weeks ago. What they didn't know was that I knew every detail of their financial collapse. Every missed payment, every defaulted loan, every desperate attempt to refinance property that had been in Harold Brennan's family since 1952. They had no idea that their future daughter-in-law worked as a senior analyst at Cascade Investment Group, or that I'd been tracking distressed agricultural properties throughout Vermont for the past 18 months. Victoria Brennan emerged from the farmhouse wearing a cream-colored wool coat that probably cost more than my monthly salary. At 58, she carried herself with the rigid posture of someone who'd never doubted her place in the world. Her silver hair was pulled back in a perfect chignon, and her smile was practiced as she air-kissed the arriving relatives. When her eyes landed on our car, that smile flickered for just a moment. "Lily, darling," she called out as we approached, her voice carrying the artificial warmth of someone performing for an audience. "How lovely that you could join us again." Again, as if my presence was some kind of charitable gesture on their part, as if I hadn't been married to her son for 2 years. Harold Brennan stood on the wraparound porch, his weathered hands gripping a coffee mug that read, "World's Greatest Grandpa," though Marcus and I remained childless much to Victoria's frequently voiced disappointment. At 65, Harold still had the broad shoulders of a man who'd worked the land his entire life, but there was something defeated in his posture that hadn't been there last year. The weight of losing the family farm was crushing him slowly. "Marcus, son," Harold called out, his voice carrying genuine warmth that he reserved only for his children. "Good to see you." "Lily." He nodded in my direction with polite indifference. Inside the farmhouse, the scene was exactly what I'd expected. The dining room table, a massive oak piece that had been handcrafted by Harold's grandfather, was set with the family's finest china. The Brennan crest, a pretentious coat of arms, that Victoria had commissioned from some genealogy website, adorned each plate. Crystal wine glasses caught the light from the antique chandelier, and silverware that probably hadn't seen use since last Thanksgiving gleamed against linen napkins. But there were only 11 place settings. 11. I counted them twice. Natalie. Brennan Cross swept into the room wearing a burgundy dress that hugged her perfectly maintained figure. At 32, she was 4 years older than me and never let me forget it. Her husband Tyler followed behind her, already nursing what looked like his second whiskey of the day, despite the fact that it wasn't even noon. "Oh, good. You made it," Natalie said, glancing at me with the same expression someone might use when noticing a stain on their carpet. "I wasn't sure if you'd be able to get time off from your little job." "My little job?" I bit back the response that wanted to escape. "My little job managing investment portfolios worth more than the Brennan family's annual income. My little job that had allowed me to quietly accumulate enough wealth to purchase their precious farm when it went to auction." Amanda Brennan, Marcus's cousin, was arranging flowers in the front hall. At 26, she'd inherited her aunt's talent for passive-aggressive comments disguised as concern. "Lily, you look tired. Are you getting enough sleep? Maybe you should consider a vacation, somewhere relaxing and affordable." The barbs continued throughout the afternoon. Victoria made sure to mention that the turkey was an organic heritage breed that cost $60, not the kind you'd find at the regular grocery store. Tyler regaled the group with stories about his latest business acquisition while making pointed comments about people who settle for mediocrity. Natalie discussed her upcoming trip to Europe, frequently glancing at me to ensure I understood that such luxuries were beyond my reach. And through it all, Marcus said nothing. He laughed at his family's jokes, nodded along with their subtle criticisms of me, and played the role of the dutiful son who'd married beneath his station but was too polite to admit it. When Victoria announced that dinner was ready, the family filed into the dining room with practiced efficiency. I followed behind, expecting to take my usual seat at the far end of the table, the spot reserved for those who didn't quite belong. But this year was different. This year there was no seat for me at all. "Oh," Victoria said, her hand flying to her chest in mock surprise. "I'm so sorry, Lily. I must have miscounted when I set the table. Harold, could you grab one of the TV tray tables from the basement? We'll set Lily up in the kitchen." The kitchen, where the help ate. Marcus looked uncomfortable but said nothing. His family continued their conversation as if this was perfectly normal, as if the woman who'd been part of their family for 2 years belonged in the kitchen while they dined in comfort. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Harold returned with a folding TV tray, the kind with metal legs and a wood-grain laminate top that wobbled with every movement. He set it up in the corner of the kitchen, near the back door where the cold November air seeped through the poorly sealed frame. Victoria handed me a paper plate, the cheap kind meant for picnics and children's parties, and began loading it with what could only be described as scraps. The heel of the turkey, dry and overcooked. Stuffing that had burned around. The edges of the pan. Green bean casserole from the bottom of the dish where it had congealed into an unappetizing mass. Cranberry sauce that had already started to separate, and mashed potatoes that had gone cold and gluey from sitting too long. "I hope this is enough," Victoria said with false sweetness. We didn't want to take too much from the main table. I sat at that wobbly TV tray, eating cold leftovers off a paper plate while listening to the warm laughter and clinking glasses from the dining room. They were toasting Harold's success in the farming business, apparently having forgotten about the foreclosure notice that would arrive by certified mail in less than 2 weeks. They were planning their Christmas gathering, assuming they'd still have the farm to host it. They were living in a bubble of denial, and I was the only one who knew it was about to burst. But what they didn't know, what none of them could possibly imagine, was that Eleanor Whitfield had called me 3 days ago. The 87-year-old woman who'd inherited the farm from her late husband had grown tired of dealing with the Brennan family's excuses and broken promises. She'd heard about my work in agricultural investments through her attorney, and she'd made me an offer I couldn't refuse. "I know you're connected to that family somehow," Eleanor had said during our phone conversation, "but I'm done with their games. If you can close by December 1st, the farm is yours for $2.8 million. Cash only." I had the cash. Thanks to my grandmother's Microsoft stock that had split and grown for 30 years, thanks to my own careful investments and savings, thanks to a life insurance policy from a great aunt I'd barely known, I had exactly what I needed. The Brennan family had spent months trying to secure financing to buy the farm from Eleanor, but their credit was shot and their debt-to-income ratio made them unqualified for any reasonable loan. They were losing their family legacy, and they didn't even know that their salvation was sitting in the kitchen eating cold turkey scraps. From my position at the TV tray, I could see into the dining room where Victoria was holding court, regaling the family with stories about her bridge club and her plans to redecorate the farmhouse parlor. She was spending money they didn't have on improvements to a property they were about to lose. The irony was so perfect it was almost poetic. Marcus appeared in the kitchen doorway, his plate in hand and guilt written across his face. "Hey," he said quietly. "I'm sorry about the seating thing. Mom's just particular about her table arrangements." Particular. That's what we were calling blatant disrespect now. "It's fine," I said, forcing a smile. "The food is delicious." He knew I was lying. The food was terrible, my seat was humiliating, and his family treated me like an unwelcome burden. But Marcus had never been good at confrontation, especially when it came to his mother. He'd spent 30 years learning to avoid Victoria's disapproval, and he wasn't about to start defending his wife now. "Maybe next year we could host at our place," he suggested weakly. Our place. Our cramped 2-bedroom apartment with the kitchen the size of a closet and no space for a proper dining table. The apartment where we lived because Marcus insisted we save money for a house while his family spent their inheritance on luxury cars and European vacations. "Maybe," I agreed, knowing that next year would be very different indeed. Tyler wandered into the kitchen, his whiskey glass empty and his face flushed with alcohol and self-importance. "How's the food, Lily?" he asked with a smirk. "Not quite what you're used to, I imagine." He was right, but not in the way he thought. I was used to much better than reheated leftovers on paper plates. I was used to restaurants where Marcus and I celebrated my work bonuses, used to the executive dining room at Cascade Investment Group, where I'd entertained clients who managed $100 million portfolios. But Tyler assumed that someone from Cedar Falls, Oregon, someone who'd grown up in a modest ranch house with a single mother who worked at the post office, couldn't possibly understand quality. "It's perfect," I told him. "Very authentic." He laughed as if I'd made a joke, then returned to the dining room where I could hear him regaling the family with my response. They found it hilarious that I thought kitchen scraps were perfect. They had no idea that their perfect family dinner was about to become a memory, because in 8 days, they'd be sitting in a lawyer's office signing papers that transferred ownership of Whitfield Acres to me. The afternoon dragged on with more of the same. Victoria made subtle comments about my outfit, my hair, my lack of contribution to the conversation. Natalie wondered aloud if Marcus and I were having problems, since we still hadn't provided the family with grandchildren. Amanda suggested that I might benefit from some professional development to help advance my career. Harold remained largely silent, but his indifference felt almost worse than outright hostility. And through it all, I smiled. I nodded. I played the role of the grateful outsider who was lucky to be included in their family gathering. Because, in just over a week, the power dynamic would shift so dramatically that they'd never recover from the shock. As the sun began to set over the rolling hills of Millbrook Valley, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that made the farm look like something from a postcard, the family began to discuss their plans for Christmas. Victoria wanted to host again, naturally. She was already planning the menu, discussing whether to serve prime rib or goose, debating the merits of various wine pairings. "We'll need to be careful about the guest list," she said, glancing meaningfully in my direction. "The dining room only seats 12 comfortably." 12, one more than the 11 who'd been welcome at today's table. Actually, Marcus said, and I could hear the hesitation in his voice. Lily and I might not be able to make it this year. We're thinking about visiting her family in Oregon. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Victoria's fork paused halfway to her mouth, and Natalie actually gasped as if Marcus had announced he was joining a cult. Oregon? Victoria repeated, as if the word itself was distasteful. But Christmas is here. It's always been here. This is where the family gathers. I know, Mom, but Lily's mother has been asking for years, and we thought maybe it was time. The guilt was immediate and overwhelming. Victoria's eyes filled with tears. Natalie began talking about family traditions and the importance of staying connected to one's roots, and Harold simply looked disappointed. They made it seem as if Marcus choosing to spend one holiday with his wife's family was a betrayal of everything the Brennan name represented. I watched my husband crumble under their disapproval. Within 5 minutes, he'd backtracked completely, assuring his mother that of course we'd be here for Christmas, that Oregon could wait another year, that family traditions were too important to break, and I said nothing. I sat at my wobbly TV, tray in the corner of the kitchen, eating cold mashed potatoes off a paper plate, and I said absolutely nothing. Because in 8 days, when the deed to Whitfield Acres was transferred into my name, when the Brennan family discovered that their financial salvation had been sitting in their kitchen all along, when they realized that the woman they'd treated like a servant now owned the ground they stood on, my silence would be worth every humiliating moment of this dinner. As we finally prepared to leave, Victoria made a show of packing up leftovers for us to take home. But instead of the usual careful arrangement of the best portions in proper containers, she scraped the picked-over remains into old margarine tubs and yogurt containers. I thought you might enjoy having some of this at home, she said sweetly, handing me a container of gravy that had already started to congeal. I know it's probably better than what you're used to cooking. What I was used to cooking. I thought about the duck à l'orange I'd made for Marcus's birthday, the beef Wellington I'd perfected during quarantine, the homemade pasta dinners that had impressed his co-workers at the few company parties I'd been invited to attend. But Victoria had never tasted my cooking, had never invited me to contribute to a family meal, had never shown even the slightest interest in getting to know the woman her son had married. Thank you, I said, accepting the containers with grace. I didn't feel. This is very thoughtful. The drive home was quiet. Marcus seemed lost in thought, probably processing the evening's events and trying to find a way to rationalize his family's behavior. He'd gotten good at that over the years, explaining away his mother's coldness and his sister's cruelty as quirks of personality rather than deliberate acts of exclusion. They'll come around, he said finally as we pulled into the parking lot of our apartment complex. They just need more time to get used to you. 2 years. We'd been married for 2 years, dated for 18 months before that, and his family still needed time to get used to me. But in 8 days, they'd have all the time in the world to get used to the fact that I owned their farm. That night, as Marcus fell asleep beside me, I lay awake thinking about Eleanor Whitfield's phone call and the papers I'd signed the previous week. The earnest money was already in escrow, the inspection had been completed, and the financing was arranged. Everything was proceeding smoothly toward a December 1st closing that would make me the owner of 500 acres of prime Vermont farmland. The same farmland where I'd been served leftovers on a paper plate just hours earlier. The same farmland that Victoria Brennan was planning to redecorate with money the family didn't have. The same farmland where Harold Brennan had spent his entire life building something to pass down to his children, never knowing that his legacy was about to pass into the hands of the woman they'd never accepted as family. I thought about the moment when I'd finally tell them the truth. Would it be in a lawyer's office, when they showed up expecting to negotiate some last-minute deal to save the farm? Would it be at Christmas dinner, when Victoria was holding forth about family traditions and the importance of keeping the property in Brennan hands? Or would it be sooner, when they received the official notice that their home had been sold to an anonymous buyer? The possibilities were endless, and each one filled me with a satisfaction that felt both justified and slightly dangerous. For 2 years, I'd absorbed their subtle insults and outright dismissals. I'd smiled through their condescension and swallowed their disrespect. I'd played the role they'd assigned me, the small-town girl who'd somehow tricked their golden boy into marriage, but would never really belong. But tomorrow, I'd start making phone calls. Tomorrow, I'd begin the process of deciding what to do with my new property. And the Brennan family, still blissfully unaware that their world was about to change forever, would continue planning their Christmas gathering on land that would soon belong to the woman they'd never bothered to welcome. Home. The morning after Thanksgiving, I woke up to 17 missed calls from my mother-in-law. 17. Each voicemail grew progressively more frantic, though Victoria's voice maintained that carefully controlled tone she used when she wanted to appear reasonable while delivering devastating news. Lily, darling, when you have a moment, could you please call me back? There's been a development with the farm situation that requires immediate attention. The farm situation. Even in crisis, Victoria couldn't bring herself to use words like foreclosure or bankruptcy. She wrapped their financial collapse in euphemisms the same way she'd wrapped my humiliation in fake politeness the night before. I didn't call her back immediately. Instead, I made coffee in our small kitchen, the same kitchen Marcus had apologized for when we'd first moved in together. "It's not much," he'd said, "but once we save enough for a house." That was 3 years ago. We were still saving, still waiting, still making excuses for why we couldn't afford the life he'd grown up expecting. What Marcus didn't know was that I could have bought us a house years ago. What he didn't understand was that I'd been carefully building my investment portfolio since college, turning my grandmother's modest inheritance into something substantial through patient, calculated risks. While he'd spent his trust fund on graduate school and a BMW he couldn't really afford, I'd been quietly becoming the kind of person who could purchase a 500-acre farm without blinking. The 18th call came while I was reviewing the closing documents that my attorney, Kate Rodriguez, had emailed me the previous week. Victoria's name flashed on my phone screen, and this time I answered. "Lily, thank goodness," she said, her voice carrying a brittle quality I'd never heard before. "I need to speak with you about something rather urgent. Could you possibly come by the farm this morning? Harold and I have a proposition that might interest you." A proposition. I almost laughed. After serving me dinner scraps on a paper plate, Victoria Brennan wanted to make me a proposition. "What kind of proposition?" I asked, keeping my voice carefully neutral. "Well, it's rather delicate to discuss over the phone. Financial matters, you understand. Marcus mentioned that you work in investments, and we thought perhaps you might have some insight into our current situation." Our current situation. Another euphemism for the financial disaster that was about to destroy everything Harold Brennan had built over 4 decades of farming. "I see," I said. "And what makes you think I might be able to help?" There was a pause, long enough for me to imagine Victoria swallowing her pride with visible effort. "Harold has been saying that we need to explore every possible option, and Marcus speaks so highly of your professional expertise." Marcus speaks so highly. The same Marcus who'd introduced me to his co-workers as my wife, she works with numbers, because he couldn't be bothered to explain that I managed investment portfolios for high-net-worth clients. The same Marcus who'd never once brought me into a conversation about the family's financial troubles, despite the fact that my job literally involved helping people navigate exactly these kinds of crises. "I suppose I could stop by," I said. "Would 11 o'clock work?" "That would be perfect. And Lily? Perhaps we could keep this conversation between us for now. No need to worry Marcus unnecessarily." No need to worry Marcus. She wanted to cut her son out of whatever desperate scheme she was cooking up, but she needed his wife's financial expertise. The irony was so perfect it made my teeth hurt. I drove back to Whitfield Acres through the same winding roads I'd traveled the night before, but everything looked different in the harsh light of morning. The postcard-perfect farm that had seemed so picturesque at Thanksgiving dinner now showed signs of neglect that I'd been too distracted to notice. Fence posts leaned at odd angles, paint peeled from the barn doors, and the fields that should have been prepared for winter showed patches of erosion that spoke to deferred maintenance and financial strain. Harold was waiting on the front porch when I arrived, his weathered hands wrapped around a coffee mug and his face carrying the weight of a man who'd run out of options. At 65, he should have been planning retirement, maybe teaching his grandchildren about farming, passing down the knowledge his own grandfather had shared with him. Instead, he was about to lose everything. "Lily," he said, standing as I approached. "Good of you to come. Victoria's inside." The farmhouse felt different, too. Yesterday's warm lighting and festive atmosphere had been replaced by the cold reality of a family in crisis. Victoria stood in the kitchen where I'd eaten my humiliating dinner, but instead of her usual composed elegance, she looked like a woman who'd been awake all night making desperate calculations. "Please, sit," she said, gesturing to the same kitchen table where she'd placed my paper plate. "Can I offer you coffee? Tea?" From paper plates to proper hospitality in less than 12 hours. Desperation had a way of adjusting people's manners. "Coffee would be fine," I said, settling into a chair that creaked under even my modest weight. Everything about the farmhouse spoke to its age and the family's recent inability to maintain it properly. Victoria poured coffee into a china cup, the same pattern from last night's formal dinner service. She was trying to create intimacy, to make this feel like a conversation between equals rather than a desperate plea for help from the woman they'd treated like hired help. "Harold and I have been discussing our options," she began, her voice carefully modulated to suggest this was a business meeting rather than a family emergency. "As you may know, we've encountered some financial difficulties regarding the farm. Some financial difficulties." I sipped my coffee and waited for her to continue. "The truth is," Harold said, his voice rough with exhaustion, "we're going to lose it. The bank's been patient, but Eleanor Whitfield wants her money, and we can't secure the financing we need. Eleanor Whitfield wants her money. If only they knew that Eleanor had already found a buyer who could pay cash." "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, meaning it despite everything. Harold Brennan might have ignored me for 2 years, but watching a man lose his life's work was genuinely heartbreaking. "None. We were hoping," Victoria continued, "that you might have some suggestions. Professional advice, perhaps. Ways to structure a deal or find investors who might be interested in agricultural properties. Professional advice, after 2 years of treating me like Marcus's embarrassing mistake. They wanted my professional advice." "What kind of debt are we talking about?" I asked, slipping into the analytical mindset that had made me successful at Cascade Investment Group. Harold and Victoria exchanged glances. $2.8 million, Harold said finally. "That's what Eleanor wants for the property. We thought we had it covered with the agricultural loan, but our credit took a hit when the dairy operation failed 3 years ago. $2.8 million, the exact amount I'd already agreed to pay Eleanor Whitfield." "And your current assets?" I asked. "The equipment is worth maybe $400,000 if we're lucky," Harold said. "Most of it's older, needs repairs. The house and barn are part of the property, so they'd go with the sale." "What about other income sources? Off-farm employment, investments, retirement accounts?" Victoria's cheeks flushed slightly. "We've had to liquidate most of our investments over the past few years. The farm's been challenging." Challenging. Another euphemism for the reality that they'd been hemorrhaging money while maintaining their expensive lifestyle. While Harold struggled to keep the dairy operation afloat, Victoria had continued her bridge club membership, her monthly trips to the salon, her weekend shopping excursions to Burlington. They'd been burning through their savings to maintain appearances while their core business collapsed. Have you considered downsizing? I asked. Maybe selling off portions of the property, keeping the house and a few acres? Eleanor won't split the property, Harold said. She wants to sell it as a complete package. Says it's too much trouble to deal with multiple buyers. Of course she wouldn't split it. Eleanor Whitfield was 87 years old and wanted a clean, simple transaction. She'd already found her buyer, someone who could close quickly with cash and take the entire property off her hands without complications. What about family loans? I suggested. Perhaps other relatives could help bridge the gap? Victoria's laugh was bitter. Marcus's trust fund is already committed to your apartment and his student loans. Natalie and Tyler have their own financial obligations. There's simply no one else. No one else. She was looking directly at me when she said it, and I understood. This wasn't really a consultation about their options. This was a recruitment pitch. They wanted me to invest in saving their farm. I see, I said carefully. And you're thinking that I might be able to help somehow? Well, Victoria said, her voice taking on that artificially sweet tone she used when she wanted something. Marcus has mentioned that you've been quite successful in your investment work. We thought perhaps you might know of someone who'd be interested in agricultural properties. Or maybe you'd consider a small investment yourself. A small investment. In the farm where they'd served me cold turkey scraps on a paper plate. What kind of investment were you thinking about? I asked. Harold leaned forward, hope flickering in his tired eyes. Even $50,000 would help. It would show the bank that we have additional resources, maybe convince them to extend our timeline. $50,000. They wanted me to hand. Over $50,000 to help them save the farm they'd never welcomed me to enjoy. They wanted me to bail them out of the financial mess they'd created while treating me like an unwelcome burden on their family. That's a significant amount of money, I said. Of course, Victoria said quickly. We wouldn't expect you to just give it to us. We'd structure it as a proper loan, with interest and a clear repayment schedule. A proper loan. With what collateral? Based on what income? They were asking me to throw money into a sinking ship while they continued to live beyond their means and treat me like a second-class family member. I'd need to see your financial statements, I said. Tax returns, debt, schedules, cash flow projections. Any investment would require proper due diligence. Absolutely, Harold said. We have everything ready. Victoria's been organizing our records for weeks. Of course she had. Victoria Brennan, who'd never worked a day in her life, had suddenly become a financial analyst when the family needed money. The same woman who'd insisted I eat in the kitchen was now preparing spreadsheets to convince me to save their legacy. They spent the next hour walking me through their finances, and the picture was even worse than I'd imagined. The dairy operation had been losing money for 3 years. They'd refinanced the farm twice, burning through equity to cover operating expenses. Victoria's spending habits had remained unchanged throughout their decline, as if maintaining appearances was more important than financial stability. Their credit cards were maxed out. Their checking account was overdrawn. They had $67 in savings and a stack of unpaid bills that would make a debt counselor weep. They weren't just facing foreclosure on the farm, they were looking at complete financial ruin. As you can see, Victoria said, her voice strained but still maintaining that false brightness, it's really just a timing issue. Once we get through this rough patch, the farm has tremendous potential. Tremendous potential. The same farm that had been losing money steadily for 3 years had tremendous potential. What's your plan for turning things around? I asked. Harold straightened slightly. I've been researching organic certification. There's a growing market for sustainable agriculture, and we have the acreage to make it work. Organic certification. A process that took 3 years and significant. Upfront investment for a man who was already 65 and drowning in debt. That's an interesting approach, I said diplomatically. What about more immediate revenue streams? Well, Victoria said, we thought perhaps we could offer farm stays. Agritourism is quite popular these days. City people love the authentic, rural experience. Agritourism. They wanted to turn their failing dairy farm into a bed and breakfast for urbanites seeking authentic rural experiences. The same people who'd never shown me an authentic moment of warmth were planning to monetize rural hospitality. That would require significant renovations, I pointed out. Guest rooms, bathrooms, commercial kitchen licensing. The upfront costs could be substantial. Yes, but the long-term potential? Victoria trailed off, apparently realizing that her argument was falling apart. The truth was, they had no viable plan. They were drowning financially and grasping at straws, hoping that someone else would solve their problems while they continued, living in denial about their situation. I appreciate you sharing all of this with me, I said finally. It's clearly a complex situation. So, you'll consider the investment? Harold asked, his voice eager with desperate hope. I'll need some time to review everything, I said. This isn't the kind of decision I can make quickly. Victoria's smile was radiant with relief. Of course. Take all the time you need. We're just so grateful that you're willing to consider helping family. Family. After 2 years of treating me like an outsider, suddenly I was family when they needed my money. I drove home with their financial documents in a folder on my passenger seat, documents that confirmed everything I'd suspected about the Brennan family's situation. They were completely, hopelessly broke. Even if I'd been inclined to help them, which I wasn't, any money invested in their farm would disappear into the black hole of their debt within months. But there was something else in that folder, something Victoria probably hadn't meant to include. A letter from Eleanor Whitfield's attorney, dated 2 weeks ago, informing the Brennans that the property had been sold to an anonymous buyer and that they had until December 15th to vacate the premises. They already knew. They'd known for 2 weeks that the farm was gone, that some mysterious buyer had swooped in and purchased their family legacy out from under them. And yet they'd spent the morning trying to convince me to invest $50,000 in saving a property they'd already lost. They weren't just desperate. They were lying. That evening, Marcus came home from his office job at a mid-level marketing firm, the kind of job that impressed his family because it came with a title but paid less than my annual bonus. He found me in our tiny living room, reviewing the Brennan family's financial documents with the clinical detachment I usually reserved for client portfolios. "What's all this?" he asked, loosening his tie and settling beside me on our second-hand couch. "Your parents asked me to review their financial situation," I said. "They're hoping I might be able to help save the farm." Marcus's face went pale. "They told you about the foreclosure?" "Among other things. Were you planning to mention that your family is bankrupt?" He had the grace to look ashamed. "I didn't want to worry you, and I thought maybe they'd figure something out." "Figure? Something out." "Marcus, they owe almost $3 million and have $67 in savings. There's nothing to figure out." "So you won't help them?" The question hung in the air between us, loaded with years of unspoken resentment and disappointed expectations. Marcus wanted me to save his family's farm, the same family that had never accepted me, never welcomed me, never treated me as anything more than an unfortunate complication in their perfect lives. "Even if I wanted to help," I said carefully, $50,000 wouldn't make a dent in their problems. It would be like trying to stop a flood with a teacup. But you could try. You make good money, and you're always talking about your investment portfolio. Surely there's something you could do. My investment portfolio. The portfolio he'd never shown any interest in until his family needed rescuing. The same portfolio that had grown large enough to purchase the farm his parents were about to lose. "Marcus," I said, "your family has treated me like garbage for 2 years. Your mother served me dinner scraps on a paper plate last night while everyone else ate. Off China. And now, suddenly, when they need money, I'm supposed to be family. He flinched as if I'd slapped him. They don't mean anything by it. That's just how they are. How they are is cruel. How they are is dismissive and condescending and deliberately hurtful. And you've never once stood up for me. That's not fair. I've tried to keep the peace. Keeping the peace isn't the same as defending your wife. We argued until well past midnight, rehashing every slight and insult his family had delivered over the years. Marcus defended them with the loyalty of a son who'd never learned to see his parents clearly, while I finally voiced the hurt and anger I'd been swallowing for 2 years. By the time we went to bed, nothing had been resolved. Marcus still believed his family's behavior was acceptable, and I still knew that I'd rather burn $50,000 than give it to people who'd never shown me basic human decency. But what Marcus didn't know, what I couldn't tell him yet, was that the question of helping his family was already moot. In 5 days, I would own Whitfield Acres. In 5 days, the Brennan family would discover that their salvation hadn't come from a stranger, but from the woman they'd never bothered to treat as family. And when that moment came, when they realized that their future lay entirely in my hands, I wondered if they'd finally understand the cost of their cruelty. The call came at 7:38 in the morning on December 1st. I was in my office at Cascade Investment Group, reviewing quarterly reports over my first cup of coffee, when Kate Rodriguez's name appeared on my phone screen. "It's done," she said without preamble. "The deed is recorded, the funds have transferred, and you are now the official owner of Whitfield Acres. Congratulations, Lily." I set down my coffee cup with trembling hands. After months of planning, weeks of paperwork, and years of enduring the Brennan family's contempt, it was finally real. The 500-acre farm where I'd been humiliated just 1 week ago now belonged to me. "What about the current occupants?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "They have 14 days to vacate, per the original agreement with Mrs. Whitfield. The sheriff will serve the eviction notice this afternoon." This afternoon. In a few hours, Harold and Victoria Brennan would receive official confirmation that their family legacy had been sold to an anonymous buyer. They would finally understand that their desperate morning meeting with me had been pointless, that the $50,000 they'd begged me to invest couldn't have saved them even if I'd been willing to give it. "Thank you, Kate," I said. "I'll be in touch about the next steps." I hung up and stared out my office window at the Burlington skyline, the city where I'd built my career while Marcus's family assumed I was just another small-town girl who'd gotten lucky. Below me, people hurried along the sidewalks, heading to jobs and lives that seemed suddenly insignificant compared to what I'd just accomplished. My assistant knocked on my door. "Mrs. Patterson, your husband is online too." Marcus, I'd been dreading this call since Kate filed the paperwork yesterday morning. "Lily, something's happened," Marcus said, his voice tight with panic. "Mom just called. Someone bought the farm. Some anonymous buyer paid cash and closed yesterday. They have 2 weeks to get out." "Oh no," I said, injecting just the right amount of shock into my voice. "That's terrible. Did they say who bought it?" "Nobody knows. The buyer used some kind of trust or LLC. Mom's convinced it's developers who want to tear everything down and build condos." Developers. Of course Victoria would assume the worst. It would never occur to her that someone might want to preserve the farm, might see value in the land Harold had worked for 40 years. "What are they going to do?" I asked. "I don't know. Mom's hysterical. Dad's not talking to anyone. They don't have anywhere to go, Lily. They put everything into that farm. Everything except respect for the woman who could have helped them." I thought but didn't say. "I'm so sorry, Marcus. Is there anything I can do?" The irony of the question wasn't lost on me. I was literally the only person who could help them now, and they had no idea. "Maybe we could let them stay with us for a while? Just until they figure something out?" Our apartment. Marcus wanted his parents to move into our 900-square-foot apartment, the same space Victoria had called quaint, in a tone that made it clear she meant pathetic. Where would they sleep? I asked practically. We barely have room for ourselves. I know it's not ideal, but they're family. We can't just abandon them. Family. The word that had been conspicuously absent when they were serving me dinner scraps but appeared magically when they needed something. Let me think about it, I said. This is a big decision. Of course. I can't believe this is happening. That farm has been in Dad's family for 3 generations. 3 generations of Brennan men who'd worked the land, built something, lasting, created a legacy. And now it belonged to me, the woman they'd never considered worthy of their family name. I spent the rest of the morning in meetings, discussing portfolio strategies and market projections, while mentally calculating how long it would take the Brennan family to realize their new landlord was someone they knew. Kate had structured the purchase through a limited liability company I'd established months ago, Cascade Agricultural Holdings. Even if they researched the buyer, they'd find only a corporate entity with no obvious connection to me. At lunch, I drove past Whitfield Acres, taking the long way around the property to see it with fresh eyes. My property. The rolling hills covered in a light dusting of early snow, the red barn that needed new paint but was structurally sound, the farmhouse where 3 generations of Brennans had lived and where I'd been treated like an unwelcome guest. Harold's pickup truck was parked in the driveway, and I could see him standing on the front porch holding what looked like legal documents. The eviction notice, probably. In 2 weeks, he'd walk away from the only home he'd ever known, carrying whatever possessions he could fit in that aging truck. Part of me felt genuinely sorry for him. Harold had never been intentionally cruel the way Victoria was. He'd simply ignored me, treating me like furniture that Marcus had brought home and would hopefully replace with something more suitable. His sin was indifference rather than malice, but the result had been the same. Victoria appeared beside him, gesticulating wildly and pointing at the papers. Even from a distance, I could see the rigid set of her shoulders, the aggressive tilt of her chin. She was probably demanding that Harold call lawyers, threaten lawsuits, find some way to fight the inevitable. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Can you come by the farm after work? Mom wants to talk to you about something. Mom wants to talk to me. The same mom who'd had 2 years to talk to me and had chosen instead to serve me dinner scraps and treat me like hired help. I drove to the farm at 5:30, parking behind the same luxury cars that had been there, for Thanksgiving dinner. Through the kitchen window, I could see the family gathered around the table where I'd eaten off a paper plate 1 week ago. They looked like survivors of a natural disaster, shell-shocked and desperate. Marcus met me at the door, his face haggard with stress. Thank God you're here. Mom's been planning all day. Planning. Of course Victoria would have a plan. She'd probably identified 3 different ways to manipulate the situation to her advantage. Inside, the farmhouse felt different again. The warm family gathering place of Thanksgiving had been replaced by something that felt more like a war room. Papers covered every surface, Victoria's neat handwriting filling yellow legal pads with lists and calculations, and what looked like battle strategies. "Lily, darling," Victoria said, rising from her chair with the kind of forced smile I'd seen her use on store clerks and service workers. "Thank you so much for coming. We need your professional expertise now more than ever." My professional expertise. The same expertise she'd dismissed for 2 years was suddenly invaluable. "I'm happy to help however I can," I said, settling into the chair they offered me. The same chair where Harold had presented their financial disaster just days ago. "We've been researching this anonymous buyer," Natalie said, her voice sharp with anger. "Cascade Agricultural Holdings. It's some kind of investment company, probably. Flipping properties for profit." Cascade Agricultural Holdings. My company, named after the investment firm where I'd learned to turn modest savings into substantial wealth. "What kind of research have you done?" I asked. Everything we can think of, Tyler said, his usual smugness replaced by genuine worry. Corporate filings, property records, business licenses, but it's all very secretive. We can't find any individual names attached to the company. Of course they couldn't. Kate Rodriguez was an excellent attorney who understood the value of privacy in business transactions. The thing is, Victoria said, leaning forward with the intensity of someone who'd found a new target for her frustration, we think we can fight this. There might be legal grounds to challenge the sale. Legal grounds. They wanted to sue the buyer who'd already closed on the property and taken legal possession. What kind of legal grounds? I asked. Harold spoke up for the first time since I'd arrived. Eleanor didn't give us a chance to match the offer. She never told us she had another buyer interested. She wasn't legally required to, I pointed out gently. Property owners can accept any offer they choose. But we had a relationship with her, Victoria insisted. Her husband and Harold's father were friends. There's history here, family connections that should count for something. Family connections, the same connections that hadn't prevented them from defaulting on their payments or failing to secure proper financing. I understand this is emotionally difficult, I said, but legally, Mrs. Whitfield had every right to sell to whoever she wanted. That's exactly what we were afraid you'd say, Natalie said, her voice carrying a hint of the old condescension. You're probably right that we can't fight the sale legally, but maybe we can approach this from a business angle. A business angle. I waited for her to continue. What if we could convince this Cascade company to sell the farm back to us? Victoria said, her eyes bright with desperate hope. Or maybe enter into some kind of partnership arrangement. With what money? I asked bluntly. Last week you told me you had $67 in savings. The reminder of their financial situation hit like a slap. Victoria's cheeks flushed, and Harold stared down at his hands. We've been exploring options, Victoria said stiffly. Loans, investors, creative financing arrangements. Creative financing arrangements. More euphemisms for schemes that wouldn't work. Have you actually been approved for any loans? I asked. Well, not exactly approved, Harold admitted. But there are possibilities. Possibilities. They were planning to approach an anonymous buyer with possibilities instead of actual money. Even if you could secure financing, I said, why would this company sell to you? They obviously wanted the property enough to pay cash for it. Maybe they're investors, Tyler suggested. Maybe they just want a quick profit. We could offer them more than they paid. How much more? 10%, Victoria said confidently. Maybe 15. That's a substantial return on investment for just a few weeks of ownership. 10% more than $8 million. They were planning to offer an additional $280,000 that they didn't have to buy back property they'd already lost through their own financial mismanagement. And where would this extra money come from? I asked. The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. They looked at each other, then at Marcus, then back at me. We were hoping, Victoria said carefully, that you might consider co-signing on a loan. Your credit is excellent, and your income would help us qualify for better terms. Co-signing. They wanted me to risk my own financial stability to help them buy back the farm they'd lost. That's a significant financial commitment, I said. Co-signing makes me equally responsible for the debt. But you'd be helping family, Marcus said quietly. And it's not like we'd default. We'd make every payment. They'd make every payment. The same people who'd already defaulted on their original farm loan were promising they wouldn't default again. I'd need to see a detailed business plan, I said. Income projections, expense budgets, market analysis. Any cosigner would require that level of documentation. Absolutely, Victoria said eagerly. We can have all of that ready by tomorrow. Tomorrow. They were going to create a comprehensive business plan overnight for a farming operation that had been losing money for 3 years. "There's something else," Natalie said, glancing nervously at her parents. "We thought maybe you could approach this Cascade company directly. As a professional courtesy, one investment firm to another. One investment firm to another. They wanted me to negotiate with myself." "What would I say to them?" I asked. "Tell them about the family history," Harold said, his voice thick with emotion. "Explain that this farm means everything to us. Maybe they'd be willing to work with us if they understood the situation. Explain that the farm meant everything to them. The same farm where they'd served me dinner scraps while discussing their plans to redecorate with money they didn't have." "I could reach out," I said slowly. "But I can't make any promises. Investment companies are typically focused on profit, not sentiment." "Just try," Victoria pleaded. "Please, Lily, you're our only hope. Our only hope." The woman they'd treated like an embarrassment for 2 years was suddenly their only hope. I spent another hour listening to their increasingly desperate schemes. They wanted to start a GoFundMe campaign, contact local news stations about the family losing their generational farm, organize community support to pressure the buyer into reconsidering. Every idea was more unrealistic than the last, but they clung to them with the fervor of people who'd run out of rational options. When I finally left the farmhouse, promising to contact Cascade Agricultural Holdings on their behalf, Victoria walked me to my car with tears in her eyes. "I know we haven't always been as welcoming as we should have been," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "But you're family now, and family takes care of each other. Family takes care of each other." After 2 years of making it clear I wasn't really family, suddenly I was expected to sacrifice my financial security to save theirs. "I'll do what I can," I promised, meaning it in ways she could never imagine. That night, Marcus and I lay in bed discussing the evening's revelations. He was devastated by his family's situation, guilty about asking me to risk my credit, and angry at the anonymous buyer who'd destroyed his childhood home. "Maybe this Cascade company will be reasonable," he said hopefully. "Maybe they'll understand that some things are more important than money. Some things are more important than money. Like basic human decency," I thought. "Like treating your daughter-in-law with respect. Like not serving family members dinner scraps on paper plates." "Maybe," I agreed. "We'll find out soon enough." "You really think you can help them?" I turned toward him in the darkness, studying his face in the dim light from our bedside clock. Marcus looked younger when he was worried, more like the graduate student I'd fallen in love with before I'd met his family. "I think," I said carefully, "that your family is about to learn some very important lessons about consequences." "What do you mean?" "I mean that treating people badly has a cost, and sometimes that cost comes due when you least expect it." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "You sound almost angry." "I am angry. Your family has treated me terribly for 2 years, and now they want me to risk everything to save them. Don't you think that's a little unfair?" "They're just scared. People don't act rationally when they're scared." "They weren't scared last week when your mother served me dinner scraps. They weren't scared when your sister mocked my clothes, or when your cousin suggested I needed professional development. They were just mean. I know they haven't been perfect, but they're still family." Family. The word that excused every slight, every insult, every moment of deliberate cruelty. "Are they?" I asked. "Because family is supposed to support each other. Family is supposed to show love and respect and basic human kindness. When exactly have they done that for me?" Marcus didn't have an answer because there wasn't one. His family had never treated me like family, and we both knew it. The next morning, I called Kate Rodriguez from my office. "I need you to contact the Brennan family," I said. "Tell them that Cascade Agricultural Holdings has received their request for a meeting and would be willing to discuss their situation." "Are you sure about this?" Kate asked. "You could just let the eviction proceed. You don't owe them anything." She was right. I didn't owe them anything. They'd made their choices, treated me according to their values, and now faced the consequences of both their financial decisions and their personal cruelty. But I wanted to see their faces when they realized the truth. I wanted to watch Victoria Brennan's carefully constructed world crumble when she understood that her salvation lay in the hands of the woman she'd never deemed worthy of respect. "Set up the meeting for tomorrow afternoon," I said. "At the farm." "And Kate? Make sure they understand that this is their only opportunity to make their case. Their only opportunity." Tomorrow, the Brennan family would sit in their kitchen, the same kitchen where they'd humiliated me, and beg an anonymous buyer for mercy. They had no idea they'd be begging me. I arrived at Whitfield Acres 30 minutes early, parking my Honda Civic behind the old barn where the Brennan family wouldn't see it from the house. Kate Rodriguez had driven separately and would arrive precisely at 2 o'clock, representing Cascade Agricultural Holdings in what the family believed would be their make-or-break negotiation with a mysterious corporate buyer. Walking through my property for the first time as its legal owner felt surreal. The fields stretched out before me, dormant under their winter covering, but full of potential I was only beginning to understand. The maple trees that lined the driveway had dropped their leaves, creating a golden carpet that crunched beneath my feet. This was mine now. Every acre, every building, every fence post belonged to me. I circled around to the back of the farmhouse, staying out of sight while observing the frantic preparations happening inside. Through the kitchen window, I could see Victoria arranging papers on the same table where she'd served me Thanksgiving scraps 8 days ago. She'd dressed for the occasion in her best navy suit, the one she wore to church and important social functions. Harold stood beside her wearing a tie I'd never seen before, his weathered hands smoothing down hair that refused to cooperate. Marcus's car pulled into the driveway at 1:45. He'd taken a half-day off work to be here for what his family considered the most important meeting of their lives. I watched him hurry toward the house, his shoulders tense with the weight of being their last hope for salvation. At exactly 2 o'clock, Kate's sleek black BMW turned into the driveway. I'd worked with her for 3 years on various investment deals, and she understood exactly what I wanted from this meeting. She was a woman who commanded respect the moment she walked into a room, with silver hair pulled back in an elegant bun, and the kind of authoritative presence that made corporate executives nervous. From my hiding spot behind the barn, I could see the Brennan family assembled on the front porch like a receiving line at a funeral. Victoria's smile looked painted on. Harold kept adjusting his tie, and Marcus shifted his weight from foot to foot with obvious anxiety. They had no idea that their entire future was about to be determined by the woman they'd spent 2 years treating like an unwelcome guest. Kate approached the house with confident strides, her briefcase in hand and her expression professionally neutral. I couldn't hear the introductions from my distance, but I could see Victoria's overly enthusiastic gestures and Harold's awkward attempt at a firm handshake. They were trying so hard to make a good impression on someone they believed held their fate in her hands. They disappeared inside, and I made my way to the kitchen door, the same entrance I'd used countless times when arriving for family gatherings where I was tolerated rather than welcomed. The spare key was still hidden under the ceramic turtle beside the steps, exactly where it had been when this was the Brennan family home rather than my property. I slipped inside quietly, positioning myself in the mudroom where I could hear everything happening in the kitchen without being seen. The mudroom was where Harold kept his work boots and Victoria stored her gardening supplies, a liminal space between the working farm and the domestic sphere where she reigned supreme. "Please, have a seat," Victoria was saying, her voice carrying that artificially warm tone she used when she wanted something. "Can we offer you coffee, tea, something stronger?" "Coffee would be fine," Kate replied in her crisp, professional voice. "I understand you have a proposal regarding the Whitfield property." The Whitfield property. Not the Brennan family farm, not their ancestral home, just a piece of real estate that had changed hands in a business transaction. Yes, well, Harold began, then cleared his throat nervously. This farm has been in my family for 3 generations. My grandfather bought it in 1952. My father expanded the operation, and I've been working this land for 40 years. I see, Kate said neutrally. And you're interested in purchasing the property back from my client. We're hoping to work out some kind of arrangement, Victoria interjected. We understand that business is business, but we thought perhaps there might be room for negotiation. Room for negotiation. They were about to discover exactly how much room there was. What kind of arrangement did you have in mind? Kate asked. I heard papers rustling, and I could picture Victoria spreading out the financial projections she'd spent all night creating, numbers that probably bore no resemblance to reality. We've prepared a comprehensive business plan, Victoria said proudly. The farm has tremendous potential for organic certification, agritourism, and value-added agricultural products. With the right investment, this property could be incredibly profitable. The right investment. The same investment they'd been unable or unwilling to make during the 3 years their dairy operation lost money. I've reviewed your financial history, Kate said, and I could hear the subtle edge in her voice. Your operation has been running at a loss for several years. There were extenuating circumstances, Harold said defensively. Market conditions, weather challenges, equipment failures. But we've learned from those experiences. Market conditions that had affected every dairy farmer in Vermont, yet somehow only the Brennan operation had failed to adapt. According to my information, Kate continued, you defaulted on your loan payments and were facing foreclosure when my client purchased the property. We were experiencing temporary cash flow problems, Victoria said quickly. Nothing that couldn't have been resolved with time. Time. They'd had 3 years to resolve their cash flow problems and had chosen instead to maintain their expensive lifestyle while their business collapsed around them. My client paid $8 million for this property, Kate said. Are you prepared to offer more than that amount? The silence that followed was deafening. I could picture the family exchanging glances, each hoping someone else would have an answer to the impossible question. We were thinking more along the lines of a partnership, Marcus said finally. Maybe your client could retain ownership while we operate the farm and share profits. A partnership. They wanted to continue living on the property they'd lost, while someone else carried the financial risk. What would you bring to such a partnership? Kate asked. Capital, equipment, expertise? Another silence. They had no capital. Their equipment was worn out and needed replacement, and their expertise had resulted in 3 years of losses. We know this land, Harold said, his voice thick with emotion. I know every field, every drainage issue, every soil condition. That kind of knowledge can't be bought. Knowledge that resulted in consistent financial losses, Kate pointed out with devastating accuracy. Now see here, Victoria said, her carefully controlled facade beginning to crack. This isn't just about money. This is about family heritage, about preserving something meaningful. Surely your client can understand that some things are more valuable than profit margins. Some things are more valuable than profit margins, like basic human decency, I thought. Like treating people with respect regardless of their background or bank account. My client is primarily interested in the property's agricultural potential, Kate said. However, they might be willing to consider alternative arrangements under the right circumstances. I could practically feel the hope radiating from the kitchen. They thought they'd found an opening, a crack in the corporate armor. They could exploit. What kind of circumstances? Victoria asked eagerly. Well, Kate said, and I could hear the careful calculation in her voice. My client has expressed some concern about the current occupant's treatment of others. Apparently, there have been reports of behavior that doesn't align with the values they want associated with their property. Behavior that doesn't align with their values. I pressed my hand over my mouth to keep from laughing out loud. I'm not sure what you mean, Victoria said, but her voice had gone up an octave. Something about serving family members dinner on paper plates while others ate off fine china? Making people eat in the kitchen while the rest of the family dined? In comfort? The silence that followed was electric with shock and growing realization. I could picture their faces, the dawning understanding that someone had told this story to the buyer, that their private family dynamics had somehow become part of the business negotiation. Who told you that? Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. My client has their sources, Kate replied smoothly. They're particularly interested in how people treat those they consider beneath them. That was just a misunderstanding, Victoria said quickly. A seating arrangement issue, nothing more. A seating arrangement issue. Even now, even when their future hung in the balance, Victoria couldn't admit to deliberate cruelty. Was it also a misunderstanding when you called someone's job little and suggested they needed professional development? Kate asked. That's taken out of context, Victoria stammered. Or when you questioned whether someone deserved to be called family. Each question hit like a physical blow. I could hear chairs scraping against the floor, imagined them shifting uncomfortably as their past behavior was laid bare by a stranger who somehow knew every detail of their cruelty. I don't understand how this is relevant to a property transaction, Tyler said, his voice defensive. My client believes that character matters, Kate replied. They're not interested in doing business with people who treat others poorly. But we're desperate, Harold said, his voice breaking. This farm is all we have. We'll lose everything. Perhaps you should have considered that before you decided that some family members deserved dinner scraps while others deserved respect, Kate said coldly. The words hung in the air like smoke, from a fire that was consuming everything they'd built. They were finally understanding that their treatment of me hadn't happened in a vacuum, that someone had been watching, someone had been keeping score. If we apologized, Victoria said desperately, if we made things right, would your client reconsider? Apologize to whom? Kate asked. To Lily, Victoria said, the name sounding foreign in her mouth when spoken with actual respect. And where is Lily in all of this? Have you asked her opinion about your proposal? Marcus started, then stopped. She's not here. Interesting, Kate said. You're trying to save your family farm, but you didn't think to include the family member whose professional expertise might be most valuable? We didn't want to burden her, Victoria said weakly. Burden her? Or did you simply not think she was important enough to include? The question hung between them like an accusation that couldn't be answered honestly. My client would like to speak with Lily directly, Kate announced. They're interested in her perspective on whether this family deserves a second chance. She's not here, Marcus repeated helplessly. Actually, I said, stepping into the kitchen doorway, I am. The reaction was immediate and devastating. Victoria's coffee cup slipped from her hands and shattered against the floor. Harold's mouth fell open, and Marcus stared at me as if I were a ghost materializing in their kitchen. Tyler actually stood up from his chair, his face pale with shock. Lily, Victoria whispered. What are you doing here? I'm here, I said, walking slowly into the room that had been the scene of so many humiliations, because Kate called me. You see, Cascade Agricultural Holdings wanted my opinion about whether the Brennan family deserved consideration for their proposal. I don't understand, Marcus said, his voice hollow with confusion. Don't you? I asked, settling into the chair at the head of the table, the seat that had never been offered to me during family dinners. Kate, would you like to explain? Kate opened her briefcase and withdrew a folder thick with documents. Lily Patterson is the primary investor and managing member of Cascade Agricultural Holdings, she announced formally. She is the client who purchased Whitfield Acres. The silence that followed was absolute. Not even the sound of breathing disturbed the perfect quiet as the Brennan family processed what they'd just heard. The woman they'd served dinner scraps to 8 days ago owned their farm. The daughter-in-law they'd never accepted held their entire future in her hands. Victoria was the first to speak, her voice barely a whisper. "That's impossible." "Is it?" I asked. "Did you ever ask what I do for work beyond Marcus's vague description that I work with numbers? Did you ever inquire about my education, my experience, my professional accomplishments? Did you ever show the slightest interest in getting to know the woman your son married?" They had no answer because we all knew the truth. They'd decided who I was based on my background and my appearance, and they'd never bothered to look beyond their own prejudices. "How?" Harold asked, his voice heavy with defeat. "My grandmother left me Microsoft stock that she bought in 1986, I said. "I've been building an investment portfolio since college. I manage portfolios worth more than $50 million for Cascade Investment Group. I've been watching this property for 18 months, waiting for the right opportunity to purchase agricultural land in Vermont." $50 million. The number seemed to echo in the kitchen like a bell tolling. "You let us humiliate ourselves," Victoria said, anger beginning to replace shock. "You sat there and listened to us beg for help when you already owned our farm. I listened to you beg for help from the same woman you served dinner scraps to on paper plates," I corrected. "The same woman you excluded from family conversations and treated like an embarrassment. Tell me, Victoria, why should I help someone who's never shown me basic human decency?" "But your family," she said desperately. "Am I?" I asked. "Because last week, when you counted place settings for Thanksgiving dinner, you counted 11. 11 seats for family and a TV tray in the kitchen for me. When you toasted family traditions, I was eating cold turkey scraps in the next room. When you planned Christmas, you worried about fitting 12 people around your table, conveniently forgetting that you've never made room for me." Each word hit its target with surgical precision. I could see the recognition in their faces, the understanding that every slight, every insult, every moment of casual cruelty was being returned to them with interest. "We can change," Marcus said, his voice breaking. "We can be better." "Can you?" I asked. "Because yesterday, when you asked me to co-sign a loan to help save this farm, you didn't ask because you trusted my judgment or valued my partnership. You asked because you were desperate, and I was your last option. Even then, even when you needed me, you couldn't treat me like an equal." "What do you want?" Victoria asked, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Money? An apology? What will it take for you to give us back our farm?" "Give you back your farm?" I repeated. "Victoria, you lost this farm through your own financial mismanagement. I bought it legally with my own money. This isn't about giving anything back. This is about deciding what kind of relationship we're going to have going forward." "What do you mean?" Harold asked. I stood up and walked to the kitchen window, looking out at the fields that now belong to me. "I mean that you have a choice. You can continue living here, working this land, and rebuilding the operation that you let fail. But you'll be doing it as my tenants, not as owners. And if you want that opportunity, you'll need to prove that you can treat people with respect." "Tenants?" Victoria gasped. "You'll pay rent," I continued. "Market rate for a property of this size and quality. You'll follow a business plan that I approve, one designed to actually make money instead of just maintaining appearances. And you'll treat everyone in this family, including me, with the dignity and respect that human beings deserve." "And if we refuse?" Tyler asked. "Then you have 10 days to vacate the property," I said simply. "I have other plans for this land, and they don't require your participation." I turned back to face them, studying the faces of the family that had never accepted me. Victoria looked broken, her perfect composure finally shattered. Harold stared at his hands, a man confronting the consequences of a lifetime of choices. Marcus looked lost, trying to reconcile the woman he'd married with the person who now controlled his family's fate. "I need an answer," I said. "Not today, not tomorrow, but soon. Because one way or another, this farm is going to be successful. The only question is whether you'll be part of that success or just a memory of what came before." 3 days later, I received my answer in the form of a handwritten letter slipped under my apartment door. The envelope was cream-colored stationery, the kind Victoria used for thank-you notes and social correspondence, with my name written in her careful script across the front. Inside, the letter was brief and to the point. "Dear Lily, after extensive family discussion, we would like to accept your offer to remain on the property as tenants. We understand and agree to your conditions regarding rent, business operations, and respectful treatment of all family members. We hope this arrangement will allow us to rebuild both our business and our relationships. Please let us know how to proceed. Respectfully, Victoria Brennan." Respectfully, a word that had never appeared in any communication from Victoria before this week. I called Kate Rodriguez that afternoon to begin drafting the lease agreement. The terms I'd outlined were non-negotiable. Market rate rent of $4,000 per month, a comprehensive business plan subject to my approval, quarterly financial reviews, and a clause allowing me to terminate the lease with 30 days. Notice for any violations of the respect and dignity standards we'd discussed. "Are you sure about this?" Kate asked as we reviewed the documents. "You could make a lot more money developing this property or selling it to actual developers. Keeping them as tenants is risky." She was right, of course. The land was valuable enough that I could subdivide and sell off parcels for luxury homes, or lease it to a corporate farming operation with guaranteed income. Keeping the Brennan family meant taking on the complications of people who'd already proven they could be cruel and financially irresponsible. "I want to see if people can really change," I told her, "and I want this land to remain a working farm." "Very noble," Kate said dryly. "Just remember that nobility doesn't pay mortgages." But I didn't have a mortgage. I owned Whitfield Acres outright, which gave me the luxury of making decisions based on principles rather than just profit. The question was whether the Brennan family could learn to live by principles too. The lease signing took place the following Monday in Kate's office in downtown Burlington. I arrived early to review the final documents, while the Brennan family came as a group, looking like defendants arriving for sentencing. Victoria wore a simple black dress instead of her usual designer outfits. Harold had traded his old flannel for a clean button-down shirt, and Marcus kept glancing between his family and me as if he still couldn't believe the situation was real. "Before we sign anything," I said, setting my pen down and looking directly at each of them, "I want to make sure we all understand what this means. This isn't charity. This isn't me giving you back something you lost. This is a business arrangement between a landlord and tenants who happen to be related by marriage." "We understand," Harold said, his voice quiet but steady. "Do you? Because for this to work, you need to accept that I'm not the same person who ate Thanksgiving dinner in your kitchen 9 days ago. I'm not the daughter-in-law you can ignore or dismiss or treat like she doesn't matter. I'm your landlord, and I'm Marcus's wife, and I deserve respect in both roles." Victoria nodded, her usual confidence replaced by something that looked almost like humility. "We understand that we've made mistakes. We're committed to doing better." "Mistakes," I repeated. "Is that what we're calling 2 years of deliberate cruelty?" The word hung in the air like a challenge. Victoria's cheeks flushed, but she didn't look away. "You're right," she said. "Finally. It wasn't mistakes. It was cruelty. Deliberate, unnecessary cruelty, and we're ashamed of it." The admission seemed to cost her something essential. Victoria Brennan had built her identity around being the perfect mother, the gracious hostess, the woman who never put a foot wrong in social situations. Acknowledging that she'd been systematically cruel to her daughter-in-law meant confronting a version of herself she'd never wanted to see. "And what about you, Marcus?" I asked, turning to my husband. "Do you understand your role in all of this?" Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I should have defended you. I should have stood up to them years ago." "Why didn't you?" "Because it was easier not to. Because I thought if I ignored it, it would eventually get better on its own. Because I was a coward." A coward. The man I'd married, the man I'd built a life with, was calling himself a coward in front of his family. It should have felt like vindication, but instead, it just felt sad. "What's going to be different going forward?" I asked. "Everything," Marcus said, meeting my eyes for the first time since the revelation. "I won't let them treat you badly, ever again. And I won't make excuses for behavior that I know is wrong. Even if it makes family gatherings uncomfortable, especially then." I studied his face, looking for signs that he was just telling me what I wanted to hear. But Marcus looked different somehow, older and more serious, like someone who'd finally understood the cost of his passivity. We signed the lease that afternoon, each signature formalizing the new reality of our relationships. Harold and Victoria Brennan were now my tenants. Marcus was still my husband, but he was also the son of people who paid me rent. The power dynamics that had defined our family for years had been completely reversed. Over the following weeks, I watched the Brennan family navigate their new circumstances with varying degrees of success. Harold threw himself into farm work with an energy I hadn't seen from him in years, researching organic certification requirements and drawing up plans for infrastructure improvements. He seemed genuinely excited about the possibility of making the operation profitable again, as if having clear financial oversight had freed him from the stress of making decisions he wasn't equipped to handle. Victoria struggled more with the adjustment. She'd spent 60 years being the unquestioned authority in her social circle, the woman whose opinions mattered and whose preferences shaped family decisions. Now she was a tenant in a house she'd once owned, answerable to a woman she'd never bothered to take seriously. I could see her fighting her own instincts every time we interacted, biting back comments that would have rolled off her tongue just weeks earlier. The first test came during Christmas planning. Victoria approached me in early December with the hesitant manner of someone walking through a minefield. "Lily, dear," she said, the endearment sounding forced but genuine. "I was wondering about Christmas dinner. Would you like to host this year, or would you prefer that we handle it?" The question was carefully neutral, but I could hear the deeper inquiry underneath. Was I going to take over their family traditions? Was I going to use my new authority to exclude them from decisions that had always been theirs? "I think you should host," I said. "This is still your home, even if the ownership has changed, but I'd like to help with the planning." Relief flooded Victoria's face. "Of course, I'd welcome your input. Your input, not your interference or your demands, but your input." It was a small distinction, but it represented a fundamental shift in how she viewed my role in the family. We planned Christmas dinner together over several afternoons, sitting at the same kitchen table where she'd served me scraps on a paper plate, but approaching the conversation as equals. Victoria shared family recipes and traditions, while I contributed ideas about menu planning and guest coordination. For the first time since I'd known her, she seemed genuinely interested in my opinions, rather than just tolerating my presence. "I've been thinking," she said during one of our planning sessions, "about what you said regarding treating people with respect. I realize I never asked about your family's Christmas traditions. Would you like to incorporate any of them into our celebration?" My family's Christmas traditions. For 2 years, she'd acted as if I'd materialized out of thin air with no history or culture of my own. "My mother always made tamales on Christmas Eve," I said. "It's a tradition from my grandmother's family in New Mexico." "Tamales," Victoria repeated thoughtfully. "I've never made those. Would you be willing to teach me?" Would I be willing to teach her? The woman who'd once suggested I needed professional development was asking me to teach her something. Christmas Eve found us in the farmhouse kitchen together, my hands guiding Victoria's as she learned to spread masa on corn husks and fill them with the pork and chili mixture I'd prepared according to my grandmother's recipe. It should have been awkward, the two of us working side by side after years of barely concealed hostility. But instead it felt like the beginning of something new. "This is more complicated than I expected," Victoria said, struggling with her third tamale while I finished my 10th. "Most worthwhile things are," I replied, and she looked up at me with something that might have been understanding. Marcus joined us as we were tying the finished tamales, his face lighting up when he saw us working together without tension for the first time in our relationship. "This looks amazing," he said, sampling the filling. "Why haven't we done this before?" "Because no one ever asked," I said simply, and the truth of it settled over the kitchen like dust. Christmas dinner itself was a revelation. The dining room table was set for 13 people, with my seat positioned next to Marcus rather than relegated to a corner, or worse, the kitchen. Victoria had used her finest china for everyone, including me, and when she offered the blessing before our meal, she specifically mentioned gratitude for family members who'd shown grace during difficult times. The conversations flowed differently, too. Instead of the subtle competition and barely veiled insults that had characterized previous family gatherings, people actually seemed interested in each other's lives. Natalie asked about my work at Cascade Investment Group, not with the condescending tone she'd used before, but with genuine curiosity about what it was like to manage large portfolios. Tyler discussed his business ventures without the implied comparisons to my little job. Even Amanda seemed to have discovered basic social skills, asking thoughtful questions about my family in Oregon and expressing interest in visiting sometime. The most significant change was in Harold. The weight of potential foreclosure had been crushing him for months, and with that pressure removed, he'd returned to being the man Marcus remembered from childhood. He told stories about farming disasters and small victories, shared plans for the organic certification process, and spoke with obvious pride about the improvements he wanted to make to the property. "I want to rebuild the greenhouse that got damaged in that storm 3 years ago," he said over dessert. "If we're going to do organic vegetables, we'll need protected growing space." "That sounds like a solid investment," I said. "Include it in your quarterly business plan and we'll discuss the budget. We'll discuss the budget." The words should have rankled, should have reminded him that he was now accountable to his daughter-in-law for every business decision. Instead, Harold nodded with what looked like relief. "It'll be good to have someone with financial expertise. Reviewing our plans," he said. "I've been flying blind for too long." After dinner, as the family settled into the living room for their traditional Christmas movie, Victoria pulled me aside in the kitchen. "I owe you an apology," she said, her voice steady but her hands trembling slightly. "Not just for Thanksgiving, but for everything. For 2 years of making you feel unwelcome in this family, for treating you like you didn't matter, for serving you dinner scraps while we ate off fine china." She paused, seeming to gather her courage for what came next. "I was threatened by you," she continued. "You're educated, successful, independent in ways I never was. You didn't need this family the way I thought women should need families, and instead of admiring that strength, I resented it. I tried to make you feel small, because your confidence made me feel inadequate." The admission hung between us like a bridge across a chasm that had separated us for years. Victoria Brennan was acknowledging not just her cruelty, but the insecurity that had driven it. "Thank you for saying that," I said. "It means more than you know." "I don't expect forgiveness right away," she said. "But I hope we can build something better going forward." Something better. The possibility hadn't occurred to me when I'd purchased the farm. I'd been focused on justice, on consequences, on the satisfaction of turning the tables on people who'd treated me badly. I hadn't considered that real change might be possible. 6 months later, I stood in the same fields where I'd walked as the new owner, but everything looked different. The greenhouse Harold had rebuilt was thriving with organic vegetables that would be certified by fall. The dairy operation had been replaced with a smaller but profitable heritage livestock program that was already generating income. The farmhouse looked better than it had in years, with fresh paint and minor repairs that reflected a family taking pride in their home again. More importantly, the relationships had genuinely transformed. Victoria and I would never be best friends, but we'd developed a mutual respect that made family gatherings pleasant rather than endurance tests. Harold treated me like a valued business partner, seeking my input on decisions and keeping me informed about the farm's progress. Marcus had become the husband I'd always hoped he could be. Someone who stood up for me without needing to be asked, and who valued my opinions as much as his family's. The quarterly business review that morning had shown profits for the first time in 4 years. The organic certification was on track, the agritourism plan was generating bookings for fall harvest season, and the farm's financial outlook was stronger than it had been since Harold's father had run the operation. "I never thanked you properly," Marcus said, as we walked back toward the farmhouse after reviewing the new irrigation system Harold had installed. "For what?" "For giving us a second chance we didn't deserve. For believing that people could change even when we'd given you every reason not to." "I didn't do it for you," I said. "I did it for me. I wanted to see if I could be the kind of person who chose forgiveness over revenge." "And what's the verdict?" I looked around at the farm that was now thriving under my ownership and the Brennan family's management, at the home where I was finally welcome, at the man walking beside me who'd learned to be a real partner instead of just a passive observer. "I think," I said, "that some gambles are worth taking." That evening, as we gathered for what had become our traditional Sunday dinner, I watched the family that had once served me scraps now treating me like the valued member I'd always deserved to be. Victoria set the table for everyone, including me, using the good china without reservation. Harold shared his weekly progress report like a colleague rather than a defensive tenant. Marcus participated in conversations as my advocate rather than my apologist. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of tension, old habits that died hard, adjustments that required conscious effort from everyone involved. But it was honest in a way our relationships had never been before, built on mutual respect rather than obligation or tolerance. As I looked around the table at these people who'd once treated me so badly and who were now genuinely trying to do better, I realized that buying Whitfield Acres had given me something more valuable than property or revenge. It had given me the power to choose what kind of family we would become, and for the first time since I'd married into the Brennan family, I was genuinely glad to be there. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.